Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've enjoyed it greatly. It's been a lot of fun, and you guys are really lucky to have this wonderful ambiance. You can count all these people and all those windows, lighted windows around, as fellow members, and they're all looking in tonight with their binoculars. Well, I'm here to talk to you about all kinds of political shenanigans, and yeah, it's Chicago. How appropriate. We've been having a good time in our table. Well, I'm going to talk about Camp Douglas this evening. The plots to attack Camp Douglas during the Civil War are well known to historians. Scholars understand that Confederate authorities were eager to free thousands of their imprisoned officers and men held in Union POW camps located in the North. As well as replenishing depleted rebel ranks, Southern leaders aimed to loose rebel soldiers on the northern landscape to cause upheaval and panic. In their plan, armed Confederate sympathizers, Northerners who opposed President Abraham Lincoln's administration of the war and his policies, would rise up, join with the freed rebel soldiers, and run riot in the North, especially in the Midwest. Together, rebel soldiers and insurrectionists would halt the Union war effort, divert federal troops to the North, and destroy Lincoln's prospects for re-election. Of the several attempts made, the plots targeting Chicago's Camp Douglas, there we go, it works, were the most daring, I think. According to plan, rebel troops operating out of Canada under Confederate agent Captain Thomas Henry Hines slipped secretly into Chicago in August and November of 1864 to act with local conspirators to attack the camp located south of Chicago. But both plots failed. Historians have generally concluded that the plots collapsed due to the incompetence of Northern sympathizers who got cold feet at the last minute or who inadvertently divulged their plans to government detectives. As well, historians argue that the plots in Chicago and other Midwestern camps excuse me, posed little threat to the stability of the North and never had a chance to succeed. The plotters' incompetence, their presumed small numbers, and the assumption that overwhelming Union military power would crush any uprising all figure in historians' estimations. In hindsight, scholars have judged that the plots existed more in fear-mongering politicians' imaginations than in reality. Excuse me. Good supper. Records housed in the National Archives and other repositories that have long been overlooked or ignored by historians point to different conclusions, however. Contrary to historians' assumptions, these records show that military officers and civilian authorities genuinely feared the prospects of large-scale revolutionary uprisings. They closely investigated threats of insurrection in the Midwest. Officials received and credited numerous reports. Well, thanks. Thank you. Is there a spot here?
Yes.
Grab a chair. Sure.
Okay.
Oh, there it is.
Brilliant.
Later.
They closely investigated threats of insurrection in the Midwest. Officials received and credited numerous reports that secret organizations boasting large memberships located in Midwestern states were in communication with Confederate agents to foment unrest in the North. Accordingly, officials worked diligently to uncover the plots and neutralize their threat. In the course of the Civil War, U.S. Army commanders in Chicago, Cincinnati, Detroit, Indianapolis, Louisville, St. Louis, and elsewhere cooperated to investigate anti-government conspiracy. As will be shown, the Camp Douglas plots of August and November of 1864 were broken up because Army officers shared information among themselves about the movements of rebel agents and their northern collaborators. Their information came from rebel turncoat informers, spies hired by the Army to infiltrate secret groups or tail suspicious persons, as well as from intercepted and opened private postal mails. Coordinated Army intelligence efforts succeeded in breaking up plots in Chicago and elsewhere, conspiracies and threats that were real and not imagined. Military intelligence efforts in the Midwest arose during the rebellion haphazardly, with no central direction from Washington, D.C. leaders. Intelligence operations arose in response to growing local threats to federal government's ability to prosecute the war. In 1861 and 1862, civilian and military officials saw the rise of secret organized groups in the North. The existence of these secret groups, which were tied to the Democratic Party and called themselves various names, but generally were known as the Knights of the Golden Circle, or KGC. However, civil authorities lacked the investigatory tools to prosecute them successfully in court. In 1863, responding to threats to the Army's ability to recruit and retain troops in the face of widespread disenchantment with the war effort, especially Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, military commanders hired civilian detectives to investigate armed organizations that encouraged, harbored, and protected deserters. They also detailed soldiers to pose as deserters to infiltrate the armed groups. Also in that year, Congress passed the Enrollment Act that created a nationwide detective apparatus under the Provost Marshal General's Bureau in the War Department. Its duty was to find and arrest deserters and draft dodgers. In this way, the Army became a domestic security agency, and its detectives roamed throughout the Midwest to investigate armed and organized resistance to the government. And I've underlined the word organized. It's really important to think of this as organized efforts. It's not haphazard. It wasn't individuals working by themselves. This was organized, and you find that repeatedly when you look at the records, when you go to the National Archives. Army agents watched people, followed them in their movements, and opened and read their private mail. Late in 1863, Army intelligence efforts scored their first major victories when they infiltrated secret groups and learned that the KGC had morphed into the Order of American Knights, or OAK, as they called themselves. This new secret organization, which was growing all over the North with many thousands of members, planned attacks on POW camps in Ohio and Indiana. Army commanders shared this information among themselves and with their Midwestern Republican governors. Acting on information from soldier spies who infiltrated the organization, officers in Ohio arrested plotters in Cincinnati, Columbus, and Covington, Kentucky, and secured indictments for conspiracy and treason in federal court. As the war continued into 1864, Democratic opposition to Lincoln increased in strength, and the secret organizations grew in numbers. Military authorities maintained their vigil and investigated secret conspiracy throughout the Midwest. The conspirators and Confederates focus, I should say, this slide I've got of these two guys, these were the guys who really had control over civilian law enforcement in the United States. Of course, it makes sense that Edward Bates, the Attorney General, is there. He was the Attorney General, and he supervised, but very, very loosely supervised, the U.S. attorneys and U.S. marshals throughout the country. Caleb Blood Smith, on the other hand, you wouldn't think he was a politician from Indiana, and he was Secretary of the Interior. But the Secretary of the Interior at this time had control of the Judiciary Fund. And the Judiciary Fund was the fund created by Congress that paid the bills for really very mundane jobs done by federal law enforcement officers, like arresting people and bringing them to trial and finding the witnesses and bringing them to the court. So, and the Judiciary Fund did not allow for the hiring of detectives. And so Caleb Blood Smith did not, and so he was asked many times by U.S. attorneys and U.S. marshals at this time to hire detectives because they were finding all kinds of problems that they wanted to investigate. And he said, sorry, the law doesn't permit. And so they didn't. They couldn't investigate. And so, he thought he was doing his duty. And as a consequence, it created tremendous hardship for the U.S. government. The conspirators and Confederates' focus on releasing rebel POWs pointed attention to Camp Douglas, the sprawling former rendezvous and training camp for Union volunteers located near Chicago that had been converted to a prison camp to hold captured rebel enlisted men. The largest such camp in the Midwest, by summer of 1864, the prisoner population swelled to over 8,000, guarded by about 800 troops. Despite garrison commanders' vigilant watch, rebel prisoners managed to escape the stockade individually or in small groups. To prevent escapes, guards received help from other sources, from other commands. In May of 1864, Army authorities in Kentucky succeeded in recapturing an escaped Camp Douglas prisoner. During interrogation, the prisoner divulged that he had been aided in his escape by, quote, the Copperheads of Northern Illinois, who gave horses and money to the escapees. The principal instrument, those were the terms that he used, of the escape effort was a Chicago man named Walsh, who employed, quote, his little daughter to play near the stockade walls and, quote, slip into the prisoners letters containing money and other articles, end quote. As I'll demonstrate, this Walsh was actually Charles Walsh, a leader of the armed organization in Chicago that later plotted to attack the camp. Kentucky officers shared this important information. This was a good find with the camp commandant of Camp Douglas. However, I found no evidence in the records of the National Archives that Chicago officers acted on this information. By the summer of 1864, Army commanders and the governors of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois were in agreement that they faced a looming danger. Their spies reliably reported that the armed organizations, most of which now called themselves the Sons of Liberty, had grown stronger and bolder and planned coordinated uprisings in August. However, most of the commanders and governors feared that any move to arrest leading conspirators would prompt outbreaks of overwhelming violence that the army, with few troops remaining to them in the north, could not quell. Governor Richard Yates, governor of Illinois, adamantly opposed any plan to arrest the known leading conspirators in the state without significant military reinforcements. Lincoln and the War Department initially ignored pleas for troops. The president was loath to weaken armies that then bogged down in heavy fighting in the South. However, Washington finally sent some raw recruits that were distributed to the POW camp garrisons, including Camp Douglas. The reinforcements had an immediate effect. For example, the arrival of troops in Indianapolis on the eve of a planned uprising to release prisoners in Camp Morton in Indianapolis on August 16 intimidated local plotters who called off their attempt. That's a photograph of Camp Morton. While reinforcements temporarily foiled Indiana conspirators, Army spies and detectives reported that Confederate authorities and leaders of the secret organizations remained determined to attack elsewhere. Important information came from Lieutenant Colonel Bennett H. Hill, the Army commandant at Detroit, whose spies kept close watch on Confederate agents, escaped POWs, deserters, and draft dodgers who congregated across the border in Canada. In early August, he reported to Major General Samuel P. Heintzelman, the commander of the multi-state Northern Department, headquartered in Columbus, Ohio, that a disgruntled Confederate officer, Major George W. Young, had divulged plans to foment an uprising in Chicago during the Democratic National Convention at the end of the month. This is August. Captain Thomas Henry Hines, a daring Confederate officer then in charge of Confederate secret operations in the North, was to command it. Hines and Confederate troops planned to slip across the border into the United States from Canada in small groups and make their way to Chicago. There they would attack Camp Douglas with the help of local conspirators, who, Young reported, numbered 5,000 5,000 armed men. The release of the prisoners, quote, would be a signal for an outbreak in the states of Indiana and Illinois, Young told Hill. Acting promptly, this was reported to Heintzelman. Heintzelman promptly ordered Hill to share the information with the Army commander at Chicago, Colonel Benjamin J. Sweet, the commandant of Camp Douglas. Severely wounded at the Battle of Perryville in 1862 while commanding the 21st Wisconsin, Sweet had rejoined the Army and assumed command of the 8th VRC, the Veterans Reserve Corps Regiment, a unit made up of invalid veterans too weak to campaign, but able to guard POW camps. Sweet immediately hired detectives to investigate. However, these sleuths failed to find the Confederates in the city. The colonel appears not to have acted on the information supplied him in May by Kentucky commanders, about organized efforts led by someone named Walsh to free rebel POWs. Now, presented with Hill's information, Sweet dismissed an imminent threat. While a secret organization existed in the city, he noted, quote, I do not believe it to be armed, and its leaders did not plot open armed hostility, he wrote. If they intended mischief, he wrote, I have not yet been able to detect it. So, while Sweet initially could find little evidence of the plot, commanders at other posts throughout the Midwest provided information on the threat of violence in Chicago. The rebel turncoat Young provided more information on Hines' movements to Colonel Hill, who passed them on to Sweet. Their plot, planned for months, he said, would be aided by large accessions of armed men from the city and region. The combined force of released captives and armed insurgents would fight their way to Kentucky and hold it for the Confederacy. Other tidbits shared by officers in St. Louis, Indianapolis, and Lexington, Kentucky, also pointed to rebel action in Chicago during the Democratic Convention. And here's a picture of that from a newspaper. As well, a Provost Marshal General's Bureau officer in Chicago, a man named Captain William James, reported that his local sources told of a plot to release prisoners and torch the city. The Army commander at Springfield ordered Sweet to avoid provocation during the convention, but should an uprising occur, he was to punish the malefactors in exemplary fashion. Heintzelman's headquarters ordered Sweet to watch the railroad stations for the arrival of Hines and his men. To help him, Colonel Hill in Detroit forwarded Hines' physical description. While troops were in short supply throughout the department, headquarters shifted an artillery battery from Columbus, Ohio to reinforce Camp Douglas. So, in sum, the military leaders from around the region took the threat very seriously and shared information among themselves to defend against an uprising in Chicago. As Chicago began to fill up to overflowing with thousands of Democratic delegates and visitors to attend the convention, General Heintzelman received orders from the War Department to travel to the city to oversee Camp Douglas's defense in person. He arrived by train late on August 29th, the first day of the convention. The general did not attend the convention itself, held in a purpose-built amphitheater on the lakefront, that right there, but instead inspected the camp and conferred with Sweet, who now, in a pinch, could turn out about 2,000 troops to repel attack. Again, he had gotten those raw recruits sent from the east as that were distributed to all the POW camps, along with that light artillery battery. Heintzelman met with prominent Democratic leaders at his hotel, the Sherman House, and elsewhere. In conversation, he learned, as he recorded in his private journal, quote, "There's a rumor that we have 5,000 troops. We may as well let them believe so." This was important. The Democratic National Convention adjourned on September 2nd, delegates having chosen former Major General George B. McClellan to challenge President Lincoln. While they made many loud and angry speeches in condemnation of the Lincoln administration, no uprising occurred in the city during the event. Shortly afterwards, the news of the capture of Atlanta, a major triumph for Union forces, reached the North. Back at headquarters in Columbus, Heintzelman wrote in his journal, quote, "What a pity the news did not occur while the Democratic Convention was in session. It would have been a bombshell in their camp. What a commentary such a remark is on their loyalty." End quote. What happened to the plot to release POWs during the Democratic National Convention? Well, all the evidence is clear that the plotters were present and ready for attack. Hines and his Confederates had eluded detectives amid the masses of visitors in the city and had holed up in hotels. The prisoners, aware of the plan, were poised to attack the garrison. Leaders of the Sons of Liberty from neighboring states in attendance on the convention also converged in the city. But the local armed group led by Charles Walsh, the Walsh whose little daughter shuttled messages back and forth with the prisoners in Camp Douglas, begged off at the last minute. Hines twice met with Walsh during the convention and learned that the Chicagoans' revolutionary zeal had waned. The cause? Newspapers circulated rumors that Heintzelman had orders to suppress the convention and had brought reinforcements to that end. Press stories of troop trains passing through the city rippled through the revolutionary ranks. Years later, one of the Confederate soldiers present in Chicago recalled, quote, "It was soon rumored about that the Camp Douglas garrison had been reinforced by 5,000 men." So that corroborates what Heintzelman wrote in his journal. Another remembered that the rumor had that, quote, the rumor, quote, had its effect upon the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, end quote. Hines' second in command, a guy named Major John Breckinridge Castleman, derisively termed the local revolutionaries timid theorists. Lacking local firepower, Hines postponed the attack. He sent most of his troops back to Canada while he and about 25 others boarded trains for downstate Illinois, scattered into several towns, and quietly organized local groups to plan another attempt. The collapse of the plot to attack during the Democratic National Convention was due to a combination of factors. First and foremost, the rumor of heavy reinforcements at the camp quite reasonably gave local revolutionaries pause. While armed, numerous, and led by bold Confederate officers, they felt themselves no match against what they believed was a powerful garrison. Second, the Army's intelligence efforts, especially Young's disclosures to Colonel Hill in Detroit, afforded commanders time to prepare, strengthen their dispositions, and present a bold front that fooled local observers. For historians to echo disgusted Confederate soldiers and judge the conspirators as feckless theorists is perhaps unjust when Army commanders made every effort with their prior knowledge to deter and defeat an assault. After the plot to attack Camp Douglas during the convention collapsed, the once complacent Colonel Sweet became more vigilant about the threat coming from armed pro-liberal groups in Chicago. In the following weeks, he used detectives, informers, and spies more extensively and effectively to keep tabs on the prisoners within the camp and the local opponents of the war in the city. His extra efforts paid dividends. Sweet reported to his superiors that he possessed names and information on the Sons of Liberty in this, quote, the Sons of Liberty in this state, city and state, and had discovered their channels of communications with the prisoners. He also revealed that his spies inside Camp Douglas, so he had people who were working for him among the prisoners. Instead, his spies inside Camp Douglas had foiled a plan by prisoners to overpower the guard on September 19th, timed to coincide with the Philo Parsons plot by Confederate agents to attack the USS Michigan, the sole naval warship on the Great Lakes, and free rebel officers on Johnson's Island, the POW camp in Lake Erie near Sandusky, Ohio. If you know your conspiracies, if you remember, the Philo Parsons was a small passenger packet that ran regularly between Detroit and Sandusky, and a number of Confederate soldiers, I think there were about 20 of them, boarded it when it made its regular stop at Malden on the Confederate side of the Detroit River, and they seized the boat and they then sailed down by the islands, and then there was another small vessel involved, the Island Queen. They seized it. They offloaded the passengers onto one of the islands in Lake Erie, and then they sailed right up to Sandusky Bay, within sight of the Michigan, which was a warship, the only warship on the Great Lakes. And then within sight of the warship, they changed their mind. and they turned tail and sailed back. They scuttled the scuttle ship, and then they jumped back onto Canadian soil. So this is a really interesting situation. So it shows some coordination between. Well, what's interesting is that, of course, we know that Johnson's Island had 2,000 rebel officers. That's what was really the key for the Confederates. They wanted to free these officers who were the cream of Southern society, and so the plots to free the enlisted men in camps such as Camp Douglas required leadership from these men in Johnson's Island. So this was the key. So this is a coordinated, fairly sophisticated conspiracy to attack these prison camps simultaneously. So anyway, where was I? That's a digression. So, as autumn advanced and Union forces continued their push into rebel-held regions of the South, Confederate agents continued to target Camp Douglas and other POW camps for attack to free rebel troops and open a new front in the war. Army intelligence officers got wind of these efforts and worked to gather more information about them. In early November, Colonel Sweet obtained reports from several sources pointing to continued attempts on the camp. Detectives reported that large numbers of Southern Illinois men recruited by Hines and his Confederates downstate were arriving on trains, and that Confederate officers had been recognized lodging in Chicago hotels. Agents working for other Army commands also tracked rebel officers to Chicago and shared this information with Sweet. Obtaining permission from the War Department to employ prisoners as spies, on November 3rd, camp officers asked a prisoner named John T. Shanks, a rebel, a Texan captured during John Hunt Morgan's raid in Ohio, to gather information about the Confederate officers in the city. Posing as an escaped prisoner, Shanks inquired at the house of prominent city judge Buckner S. Morris and his wife Mary, both of whom were known to the Army for having aided prisoners to escape. The judge told him that an uprising would soon occur in the city. Shanks reported this to camp commanders, and on November 6th, went to the Richmond House Hotel, where he met Confederate officers who had served with him in Morgan's command. Some of the officers spilled information about an imminent attempt on Camp Douglas on Election Day, November 8th, when Hines would lead local armed conspirators in an attack. The freed prisoners, equipped with guns supplied by the local secret organization, would then rampage through the city and the state. Armed with information of an impending attack, on the evening of November 6th, Colonel Sweet dispatched a messenger by rail to Springfield. He sent it by train, didn't send a telegram. And this is really interesting because he says it's not safe to send a telegram. I think the telegraph operations have been infiltrated. So a little bit of paranoia there. He deemed the telegraph message insecure. He warned his superior at Springfield that the city was full of suspicious characters, including Captain Hines and other rebel troops who had been in Chicago during the Democratic National Convention. The situation was too dangerous to await orders, he reported. He intended, quote, to arrest these officers, if possible, before morning. The head gone, we could manage the body. He also planned to arrest several prominent citizens involved in the plot, quote, of which the proof is ample, end quote. Sweet lost no time. In the early morning hours of Monday, November 7th, troops under his orders from the camp garrison marched into the city and arrested rebel officers in the Richmond House and several civilians in their houses, among them Judge Morris and Charles Walsh. Sweet identified Walsh as the local brigadier general of the Sons of Liberty organization. Morris was its treasurer. At 3 a.m. that morning, troops surrounded and raided a house where Hines was known to be, but Hines eluded escape by hiding in the bed of the residents of the house. During the search, the lady of the house, quote, complained of being quite sick and kept her bed all day, thus shielding the rebel agent in the bed covers. Hines slipped away and out of the city only when the troops guarding the house were relieved the following morning. So, oops, I skipped ahead. I got the wrong thing. I left out a picture of Thomas Henry Hines. His other callers made, Sweet felt secure enough to telegraph General Cook. Oh, I did have that. I saw it. There he is. Yeah, General John Cook of the 7th Illinois. Sweet felt secure enough to telegraph Cook to report the arrest of noted conspirators. Cook feared that Camp Douglas was still threatened with attack on election night and requested reinforcements from other Midwestern commands. Among other help, 4 companies of troops arrived by train from Indianapolis. In the meantime, as the city awoke on November 7th to learn the astonishing news, Sweet's troops fanned out in the city and seized large quantities of firearms and ammunition at the house and livery stables of Charles Walsh. Hundreds of loaded revolvers and shotguns that were to arm the freed rebel prisoners. Using the seized guns, military commanders equipped an ad hoc militia cavalry force to patrol the city in the following days. Amid the tumult and excitement on Election Day, voters went to the polls to cast ballots for state and federal candidates. Troops seized records of the Sons of Liberty, some of them valuable, wrote Sweet, and showing, quote, the intents and purposes of the organization, he wrote. During the next several days, Captain William James of the Provost Marshal General's Bureau and his agents arrested and interrogated 96 men, confirming that the plot aimed to liberate rebel prisoners. Downstate Provost Marshal's deputies also captured men who had eluded city dragnets, eliciting confessions of involvement in the Camp Douglas plot. Oh, there he is. I got my notes mixed up here, sorry. Military and federal political authorities put the Chicago conspirators on trial by military commission, which took place at the department headquarters in Cincinnati in the early months of 1865. The trial served as a sequel to the military commission trials held in Indianapolis from September 1864 to January 1865. There, the Army tried Indiana leaders of the Sons of Liberty for conspiracy to release POWs at Camp Morton and raise revolt. Occurring during the fall election season, Republican leaders in Washington clearly intended the Indianapolis trials to influence voters' attitudes and equate Democrats with traitors. Republicans undoubtedly succeeded, winning many states handily. Taking place long after the fall elections, however, the Cincinnati trial of the Chicago conspirators, including Buckner Morris and Charlie Walsh, and several Confederate officers, did not have immediate election propaganda value. But the widely reported trial, based on the evidence of Army spies and informers, helped cripple Democrats for years by portraying them as the party of pro-Confederate conspirators. In November 1864, through careful investigations arising from genuine concern about large-scale insurrection and violence, Army commanders successfully broke up another attempt to attack Camp Morton and Camp Douglas and loose thousands of Confederate prisoners on the north. Intelligence sharing among different military commanders in the region again proved decisive in affording the Army time to move scarce troops and prepare defenses. Moreover, quick action in November, based on reliable information, allowed Colonel Sweet to arrest rebel officers poised to lead local armed revolutionaries. Additionally, in September, Sweet's new vigilance in detecting covert activities in Chicago and Camp Douglas headed off another attempt to break out of the prison in conjunction with the Philo Parsons plot. So we're talking about 3 instances. And in 3 instances, intelligence efforts prevented violent upheaval in Chicago during the rebellion, averting civil war and additional bloodshed in the north, and avoided the creation of a new northern front. In summary, archival evidence shows that during the war, the U.S. Army engaged in extensive domestic espionage to counteract the existence of powerful and widespread underground organizations in the North. The plots in Chicago were part of a larger effort throughout the Midwest to subvert the Union war effort and help the Confederacy win independence. But the Army's concerted intelligence efforts defeated the conspirators' movements and helped preserve the Union. Thank you very much. Are there any questions that you have? Yes, sir.
A little bit off your subject possibly, but during your research, did you ever encounter where former Confederates who had deserted and taken the oath of allegiance served as guards at Confederate prisons?
No. But the issue of men who swore allegiance, who former soldiers, is an important one. And that there's who's the guy who wrote the book Galvanized Yankees?
D. Brown.
Right.
D. Brown.
Well, but there was also someone else though.
That was the book. He had an article and published by the University of Illinois Press about 50 years ago, originally.
But there's a more recent one. I'm forgetting the name of the author then. But and he used the same title of Galvanized Yankees. And there are 100,000 Southerners who, not necessarily Confederate captured POWs, but Southerners who took the oath and served in the U.S. Army. There were many of them. So, yes, sir.
If there were 6,000 to 8,000 prisoners in Camp Douglas that they were looking to spring, and in theory a couple thousand sympathizers in Chicago, did they ever find more than a couple hundred firearms that Walsh had hidden away to arm all the thousands of prisoners?
Good question. And the question is, what about how many arms were there to arm the prisoners? There was a Camp Douglas arsenal that supplied the garrison, and that was right on site. And that was part of the plan. They would seize that, and there were a lot of arms there. And then the arms at Charlie Walsh's place would supplement that. They're mostly revolvers and shotguns. So that would have armed quite a few, but probably not all of them. So many of them would have been unarmed, probably, and they would have to have found more arms elsewhere. One of the memoirs of the Confederate soldiers who were involved in this was written by a guy named George A. Lightning Ellsworth. If you're familiar with the Morgan Raid, the Great Raid into Indiana and Ohio, Ellsworth was his telegraph operator, and he wrote a memoir in 1882, and I had the pleasure of editing it for publication. And it's a great read, both for telling about telegraphic operations and how all the shenanigans that he did with telegraphy, but Ellsworth was one of the guys who was working out of Canada under orders of Thomas Henry Hines. And he was in Chicago both in August and November. And he tells in his memoir about being at Walsh's house, doing the tedious work of loading all those shotguns and revolvers. And he said, we were there for days loading. All we did was load guns. So, yeah. So there was a question. Yeah.
Well, there have been prisoners of war for obviously thousands of years in wars. Has there ever been an instance of a plot like this ever succeeding?
I don't know. Hollywood, probably. The Great Escape.
I don't know. I was trying to think, but I couldn't think of one, certainly.
Yeah. No, you're good. That's a good question. It's a good question. Can anyone think of any successful major breakouts of in a prisoner of war camp? I can't either.
Second war.
Does this argue for the improbability of the success of such a venture that's never happened before or since in
That's very possible.
military history?
But I think one of the key elements in this case is that there was significant support for the breakouts from the outside. And in the cases in Camp Douglas, but also in Camp Morton in August, the plots in Camp Morton, and also Camp Chase in Columbus, Ohio, there was assistance from the outside. And so it's very possible. Perhaps that ups the probability of success. I don't know. But none of them, of course, succeeded in reality. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, well, we're used to shenanigans going on during Democratic National Conventions here. Was there some particular reason to choose that time? Were all these politicians here supposed to provide cover or something? Or why then?
Yeah, that's a good question. Why during the Democratic National Convention in 1864? I think we can conjecture that the Confederate authorities and the local conspirators were thinking that the city was going to be chock full of people, and it was. And the city was full of visitors to attend the convention, but also to just be around the amphitheater. And so many thousands of people came to Chicago to be there, to be on hand during the convention. And so it was easy to get lost in the crowds. And as the newspapers at the time reported, it was easy pickings for the pickpockets. And because the streets were crowded, and people were boarding. Ted Karamansky writes in his excellent history of Chicago during the Civil War, during the convention, the city was chock full of people when people were hiring out their houses as boarding houses for people to attend the convention. And so it was just crowded with people. And that's a great backdrop for someone to get lost in the crowd, and that was part of the idea, to be lost in the crowd and to not be able to be found, and then launch your plot.
The guy in a POW, I mean, these guys aren't exactly dressed in suits and ties. How are they going to get lost in a crowd of politicians that are, maybe smoking? It's not
Well,
smelling good, but they're dressed nicely.
Well, the POWs are going to be dressed in their Confederate uniforms if they have them. The Confederate agents were dressed as civilians, and they were packing revolvers. So, and they were shacked up in hotels, 10 men to a room, as the memoirists wrote. So, yes, sir.
Was anyone of the people who were apprehended, were they ever tried or convicted or not?
Right. There was the trials. As I mentioned, the trial was in Cincinnati of the Chicago conspirators. It went on from January to April 1865, just before. Well, actually, it didn't even end before Lincoln's assassination. And the chief prosecutor for it, the judge advocate, a guy named Henry L. Burnett, was he was summoned to Washington to be part of the investigations for the Lincoln assassination. But they tried the captured Confederate officers and Buckner Morris and Charlie Walsh for conspiracy. And Walsh was convicted and began to serve. The officers, one of the officers escaped. One of the Confederates escaped. One committed suicide. The most famous, of course, is Greville. What's his name?
Greville?
Yes, Saint Leger, the English officer who was aide-de-camp to John Hunt Morgan. He was convicted and sent to the dry Tortugas, and he tried to escape during a storm and was lost at sea, or we think, because he never showed up again. So that was the disposition of those prisoners. Buckner Morris got off. He was acquitted.
Here, one more.
Yes.
Was one of the Confederate agents reverend or someone who posed as a minister? I seem to remember reading something about there were some supposedly a man posing as a religious person or was a religious person in Chicago would go visit the prisoners and was involved in a plot.
I'm not familiar with that. Yeah. Only the closest possible connection to that in Indianapolis during the attempt in Indianapolis in mid-August of 1864. There was there were informant sent a message to Governor Morton saying, tipping him off that a shipment of arms from New York City was arriving in Indianapolis, and these were supposed to be marked, and they were marked as stationary, but it was the way it was reported in the newspapers. They were supposed to be marked as Sunday school books. So, but that wasn't accurate. So, but that became folklore. So I don't know about that story about the person in clerical garb. So, any others?
Well, thank you, Stephen, for a
Thank
very
you.
good talk.